We've been talking a lot about President Jack Kennedy and his connection to civil rights. And one of the things that I'm hopeful that you took away from the last lecture is that in a lot of ways, Kennedy never took up the cause of civil rights. He was forced to take it up by the movement, whether you're talking about Freedom Riders or whether you're talking about MLK picketing in Birmingham, Alabama, and the reaction that that ultimately got. In any case, when he took up the cause, people in later times would call that the Second Emancipation Proclamation, considering it had been approximately 100 years since the federal government had really issued any kind of meaningful civil rights legislation. This was seen as monumental as 1863 and Lincoln's freeing of the slaves. The bottom line is we don't really know what Kennedy's approach to civil rights would have ultimately looked like because he died before it could be implemented. He was assassinated in Dallas in November 1963. And the man that took over for him is what has been described as a different type of Democrat. Lyndon Johnson of Texas was a Southern Democrat. And he had been put on the ballot in 1960 really to provide balance to Kennedy's candidacy. I mean, Kennedy was from Massachusetts. He was considered to be liberal on a lot of different things, and the thought was, perhaps Southern Democrats might not go for this guy, so we better provide somebody else that can kind of even out the ticket. Now, Johnson, in addition to being a Southern Democrat, was a brilliant politician. Whether you love LBJ or whether you can't stand the sight of him, he really was a gifted politician. A very shrewd politician, very skilled at being able to manipulate the process to be able to produce the results that he wanted. He had a little black book that he kept with him basically at all times, and he would keep every single Washington scandal in this little black book, and nothing got by this guy, and everybody knew about this black book. Every $100 handshake that took place in a Washington restaurant, or every sex scandal that somebody didn't want to go public, was in that little black book, and people feared the black book. And what Johnson would do is give whoever it was that he was talking to what he called the Johnson treatment. And he'd get right in people's face, and he'd really ask them, are you sure that we can't work together on this initiative? Are you sure that you don't want to vote for this this policy? And what he was really asking them was, are you sure you want that dirty little secret that we both know I know about to go public? And it was quite effective. Later on in his life, he said, look, it might have been Jack Kennedy that had all the glitz and glamour, but who do you think did the heavy lifting to get those laws passed? Okay. The product of the Johnson treatment. So while he was really rough around the edges, he was really good at hammering through legislation, similar to Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal era. Now, we've talked about LBJ and his connection to civil rights. I've told you about the Longoria affair, the role that he played within that particular incident in civil rights history. Lyndon Johnson largely picked up where Jack Kennedy left off in the realm of civil rights. We've still got a time period that's drenched in violence with respect to civil rights organizing. Racists bombed churches throughout this time period, primarily because that's the 16th Street Baptist Church, for example, in Alabama, was the site of many organizing campaigns. It was the headquarters for many of these organizing campaigns, and the Klan knew about it. On this one particular occasion, the Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, and the only people that were there on that particular occasion were 4 little schoolgirls who were just getting out of Sunday school. And so, this type of violence that was happening seemingly all the time really served to buttress Johnson's cause when it comes to civil rights reform. Partly out of the legacy of Jack Kennedy, the fallen president, and partly because it was something that he had always held near and dear to his heart, civil rights that is, Johnson really picks up the mantra that is civil rights. In 1964, largely at Johnson's behest, Congress passes something called the Civil Rights Act. This is an enormous civil rights breakthrough because in a lot of ways, it's the first piece of civil rights legislation in almost 100 years. What the Civil Rights Act does is it outlaws what can largely be called apartheid in public accommodations. The idea that African American people could not eat at a lunch counter, people of color generally speaking, anybody for that matter, that they would be relegated to this section of the movie theater, or they'd have to ride in the back of the bus, anything. If you service the public, then you need to service all of the public. You don't get to pick and choose who you would like to provide service for, a product for, and who you choose not to. If you've ever seen signs in windows that says no shirt, no shoes, no service, generally speaking, what that means is if you're not wearing shoes, if you're not wearing a shirt, or if you're not being decent, civil, then they can throw you out. But if you're doing all of those things, then they, by law, have to serve you. Those of you that follow the news may understand that the Civil Rights Act has a very important role to play today, especially with what's going on in the LGBT community. Okay? But the Civil Rights Act, it basically makes Jim Crow America illegal. Okay? Now, the other thing that I want you to understand about 1964 is the activists don't take their foot off the gas when it comes to civil rights organizing. In 1964, a group of college students, many of them from the upper Midwest, states like Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin, they organized what came to be known as Freedom Summer. One of the things that these activists are very aware of is that in states like Mississippi, people don't even have the right to register to vote, let alone the right to cast that ballot. And so this group of activists looked around and they targeted Mississippi because Mississippi was not only the poorest state in the country at the time, it was probably the most deeply entrenched racist state in the country at the time. And so the whole purpose of the Freedom Summer campaign was to register African American people to vote. And the thought was pretty simple. If you can get them to vote, once they start voting, they'll start to vote for politicians, whether they be black or white, that will continue to legislate civil rights. So while the overwhelming point of Freedom Summer was to register people to vote, there was a broader goal in the sense that when a lot of these activists, both white and black, arrived in the South, in Mississippi, what they did was they set up what came to be known as freedom schools, and they would teach African American children, not only providing them with a quality education, but teaching them African American history or things that were largely left out of mainstream educational circles at the time. Now, over the course of time, two things happened. Number one, just like the Freedom Riders, Freedom Summer provoked an awful lot of violence from the racist establishment. There's a very good movie entitled Mississippi Burning that talks a little bit about this issue of Freedom Summer. It opens up with a car chase, and it's ultimately you come to find out that it's the Ku Klux Klan that's chasing these three civil rights activists that are trying to get people registered to vote. Two of these activists are white, one happens to be black, and there was an FBI manhunt all across the state of Mississippi looking for their bodies. Ultimately, they were pulled out of a swamp in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and like the Freedom Rides, this violence, this civil rights news was beamed into people's living rooms on a day-by-day basis. The other thing that I'd like you to understand about Freedom Summer was that a lot of these activists begin to realize that it's not simply a lack of black participation in the democratic process that's a problem, that's problematic. It's the Democratic Party itself. And of course I'm talking about Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Big D Democratic Party. The Democratic Party of Mississippi had been the dominant party of Mississippi like it was all across the South, really since the 1820s with Andrew Jackson. The problem was it was the party of the Klan. It was the party of secessionists in a lot of ways in the Civil War era. It was the party of segregationists. Now, Franklin Roosevelt Jack Kennedy, everybody in between them, never really got serious about bringing these politicians and bringing these states to task, largely because, the effectiveness of the New Deal mostly hinged on whether or not the South was going to go along with it. So knowing that, you'll know how difficult it would have been for Franklin Roosevelt to get an anti-lynching bill passed, for instance, or maybe why Jack Kennedy really was reluctant to take up the cause of civil rights, right? Anyway, there's people that really understand that in order to change America, we're really going to have to change the Democratic Party, and a lot of this is going to start here in Mississippi. The Democratic Party of Mississippi was almost, it was exclusively white. Knowing that they had to change this, Freedom Summer activists started a rival Democratic organization that they called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Now, the Freedom Democratic Party was not only an integrative organization, it was a rival organization to the mainstream, exclusively white Democratic Party of Mississippi. 1964 is an election year. Lyndon Johnson's running for re-election. The Democratic National Convention that year was held in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And there's a big question as to which Democratic coalition is going to be seated from the state of Mississippi. Is it going to be the mainstream one, the exclusively white one, or is it going to be the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party? If you're Lyndon Johnson, you're really caught between a rock and a hard place on this because, you don't want to make waves because you still need the South to win this election, but at the same time, you don't want to tell these activists to kind of sit down and shut up, primarily because you really believe in their cause at the end of the day. One of the people that lobbied to be seated, to have the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party seated, was a woman by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. And Fannie Lou Hamer gave this really passionate speech on the floor of the Democratic National Convention in 1964, and it's a speech entitled, "Is This America?" ? Is this America? And she says, I question, is this America where people can disappear in the middle of the night? I'm paraphrasing, of course. Is this America where you have to sleep with the phone off the hook so that you know that in a moment's notice that you can call 911 and have the police come out because your house or your car is in danger of being firebombed? And although the powers that be, Lyndon Johnson included, within the Democratic Party, tried their best to kind of keep this speech on the down low, so you see that most people didn't hear it, that message had gotten through. And ultimately, there's sufficient pressure put on the National Democratic Party to at least seat a few of these Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegates. Now, in response to this, the mainstream, exclusively white Democratic Party of Mississippi just protested and walked out of the convention. But you can see some things are changing, and they're changing within the Democratic Party itself, which a little bit later in this lecture we're gonna talk about with respect to the Voting Rights Act. 1965 is an important year for a number of different reasons, but it's a very important year. 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated while he was given the speech in Harlem, New York. Now keep in mind, Malcolm X had stood for sort of the most visible symbol of black separatism up until 1965. He preached this really fiery brand of Islam, and he, at least from a symbolic standpoint, was much more militant than the mainstream civil rights movement. And even whites that were sympathetic to the civil rights cause were more or less turned away by Malcolm X and some of the people that he associated with. And that really changed toward the end of Malcolm X's life. And one of the reasons for that is he had gone on this pilgrimage, as a Muslim, he had gone on this pilgrimage to Mecca. And it was in Africa that he discovered that not only were there white Africans, but the idea of indicting an entire race simply because some people within that race are bad people is probably not any better than the system of Jim Crow or the system of racism as it functioned in the United States. And so he really began to ease up on this whole idea of, separating the races. He really eased up on the idea of Martin Luther King kind of rolling over and being a pushover within the mainstream movement. Later on, toward the end of his life, he really began to kind of maybe not accept whites into their ranks in a mosque or an organization that he called Islam Incorporated. But he also he did let them help the movement, I guess you could say. He just couldn't join the organization specifically. At the same time, Malcolm X was gaining huge levels of notoriety within mainstream circles in the United States. And one of the people that was very jealous of this was the leader of the Nation of Islam, our friend Elijah Muhammad. Now, we don't know exactly how all of this went down, but the two people that are currently doing time for Malcolm X's murder were members of the Nation of Islam. And what a lot of people believe was that Elijah Muhammad became jealous of Malcolm X's rise in political circles in the United States and had him assassinated. But in the aftermath of Malcolm X's death is when you begin to see the rise of what historians call Black Power. Black Power traces its roots, at least in terms of its terminology, to an activist within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee by the name of Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was, again, a militant activist, and although he associated with Martin Luther King, and although he agreed with a lot of what Martin Luther King said and what he was doing, he didn't exactly walk in lockstep with him, if you understand what I'm trying to say. Stokely Carmichael, after the assassination of Malcolm X, basically told everyone, hey, look, you need to tell as many people as you can tell that everybody that was interested in turning the other cheek and rolling over, they're either all dead or been purged from the movement, and now what you're going to deal with is the rest of us. And he coined the term Black Power, which would come to mean a very militant, very proactive form of civil rights organizing. Malcolm X had used the expression by any means necessary. We were talking about this in the context of the Johnson-Hinton incident in Harlem. But there's a lot of groups that are going to grow out of this context of Black Power that are going to be very militant, but may or may not have misinterpreted the message of Malcolm X when he was living. Okay? One example that we can point to would be the Black Panther Party. The Black Panthers originated in Oakland, California, and they were largely a response to the police of that city, who roamed the city, arresting African-American youths seemingly indiscriminately, throwing them in jail, locking them away without charging them, clear-cut violation of their constitutional rights. And so when Huey Lewis and Bobby Newton started the Black Panther organization, they started it to monitor police behavior. There was a law in California that said that you could stand a reasonable distance away from a police officer, and the state defined reasonable distance as approximately 9 foot away, and you could take notes on what this police officer is doing. Now, you can imagine that the cop is probably not going to like that very much, but there was also a law that said in California you could do this while you were armed. So if you're doing the math with me here, what you've got are African-American activists in long black trench coats wearing black berets, shotguns slung across their chests, monitoring police behavior. That's a very different image of African-American protest. I mean, similar to Malcolm X, this kind of African-American assertiveness had not been witnessed, and the bottom line was white America just did not know what to do with it. I mean, I'm talking about people within liberal circles that really just did not know what to make of this, because not only had Martin Luther King really kind of advocated nonviolent resistance and nonviolent images of nonviolent resistance, this was a completely different animal that people simply did not know what to make out of it. My point is, there's good things and there's bad things about this issue of Black Power. Part of the negative side of it is the imagery which people that, some of whom oppose various aspects of civil rights legislation, tend to cite when it comes to these angry activists that are using violence to implement their means, and the ends justify the means. Now, for his part, Martin Luther King also accelerates his civil rights activism in 1965 as well. Similar to Mississippi, there had been civil rights activists trying to get people registered to vote in Alabama. 3 of them had been murdered for their efforts, and to honor them, King organized a march from Selma, the site of their killing, to the state capital, Montgomery. And we've had the anniversary of Selma. More recently, of course, there's the film, the modern film Selma, that talks about what happened on that bridge in Alabama. Almost from the instant that these people begin to march, they're attacked by police officers. And once again, all of this violence is coming right into your living room, okay? So the result of all of this, guys, the result of all of this activism within civil rights circles, whether you're talking about MLK and much more mainstream circles, or whether you're talking about Malcolm X and what would later become known as Black Power, the result was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what this law says is basically states that have a history of discriminating and making it difficult for specific groups of Americans, African Americans and others, states with a history of, these kind of sneaky laws would have to have those laws approved through the federal government in Washington before they could become the law of their states. So if there was a law, for example, that said if your grandfather could vote in an election, then you can vote in an election. In order for that to be a meaningful and real law in Alabama, for example, Washington would have to approve it. And of course, the federal government was not going to allow these laws that were clearly targeted to suppress specific segments of the voting population. We're not going to do that. And so from the moment that this goes into force, you see 2 things. One, you see many more African Americans participating in the democratic process, and you also see those African Americans electing liberal white politicians that are legislating civil rights, and you also see them electing African American politicians that clearly have some sort of connection to this idea of why civil rights reform is so necessary. But once again, guys, just like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this would not have been possible had it not been for that grassroots activism. People like Stokely Carmichael that are fighting this fight out there in the streets, as opposed to some liberal politician that's just kind of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. 2,000 miles away from Selma, there's another civil rights movement that's beginning to emerge in California. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta were activists within the Mexican American communities in the Delano district of California, the wine country of California, if you will. In 1962, they left the organization, the Community Action organization that they had helped to found and oversaw. They left it to form a new organization called the United Farm Workers Union, the UFW. Now, think back to the Wagner Act in 1935. There were 2 groups that were excluded from the ability to form unions. One was domestic servants, maids, butlers, people like that. The other was farm workers. There's a lot of reasons why those 2 groups were specifically excluded, but for our purposes, I need you to understand that that's really going to disproportionately affect African Americans and, shall we say, Latinos, predominantly because those 2 groups make up huge segments of those 2 job classifications. In any case, the UFW is basically an illegal organization as far as the federal government is concerned. But Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta implement a 1965 table grape strike. They encouraged Americans all across the country, from California to the East Coast to the South to the Northwest to everywhere, to not buy grapes that were produced by these Delano growers, because the conditions of these Delano growers were just abysmal. The wages were pathetically low. But just like the labor movement of the 1930s, there's also clear-cut connections to civil rights, this time in a Southwestern, in a Latino kind of context, but there are connections to the civil rights movement, okay? So what the UFW ultimately became was what we call La Causa. And La Causa was this social movement that was designed to not only, resolve some of these issues affecting workers on the farm, but it was also designed to empower people, the Latino community in particular, that had really been powerless up to this point, had been abused, had been exploited up until this point. Now, in the process, they're registering some 100,000 new voters, many of them who come from Mexican ancestry. Now, the legacy of the UFW, La Causa, everything that I've talked about to this point, is what you and I call the Chicano movement, right? This social movement, largely of people from Mexican heritage, people that live and in a lot of cases were born in the United States but have Mexican ancestry. And this effort to bring about better working conditions and just simply civil rights and civil liberties to this demographic of people of Mexican ancestry, is really going to have a direct relationship to the Chicano movement to empower people of Mexican background. Talk more about that as the class unfolds. But for the time being, all of this pressure, whether you're talking about Delano or whether you're talking about Selma, all of this pressure ultimately manifests itself in Lyndon Johnson's first full term as president. As I said before, Lyndon Johnson was up for election in 1964. Now keep in mind, he inherited the presidency. He didn't, win an election. And so in 1964, he's running against a conservative Republican from Arizona by the name of Barry Goldwater. Simply put, Lyndon Johnson destroys Barry Goldwater for a lot of reasons, but primarily because the conservative movement at this point is very disorganized. But anyway, he really wins a landslide victory in 1964, which gives him the confidence to say, we're going to get really serious about reforming civil rights in this country. And it starts with what Lyndon Johnson calls his Great Society. Now, if you're following along with me on that PowerPoint presentation, there's an image of Lyndon Johnson at the bottom of the slide entitled Great Society, and he's giving a speech. And he's giving that speech at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And in that speech, he's outlining his vision of the Great Society. And this Great Society would, like Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, empower people from the bottom up, that we would build a great society by focusing on the weakest links in American society, the people that need attention the most. Really, there are only three parts of the Great Society that I want you to have in your notes. Lyndon Johnson said we need to focus on the cities, we need to focus on cleaning up the environment, and we need to focus on public education. If we can really address those three things, I think we can really begin to have this Great Society program take off. And so with respect to public education, what you get are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is going to pump billions of dollars of government resources into improving the American public education system. The Higher Education Act, I'll tell you right now, I never would have made it through college, let alone graduate school, had it not been for Pell Grants and other sorts of government assistance programs, many of which trace their roots back to LBJ's Great Society. But this is the time period that Medicare and Medicaid, health care for people that either can't afford it or people that are a little bit too elderly to purchase it through conventional avenues, this is the time period that those programs come into society. And in ways, if you think about it, he's kind of building off of what Franklin Roosevelt started a security blanket. But one thing that Franklin Roosevelt was never able to get accomplished was a national health care program. Harry Truman either, for that matter, right? And Medicare and Medicaid are clearly advancements when it comes to a program that can ensure people that probably are not going to find health insurance through conventional means. Johnson also improved the park system, but one of my favorite programs in the Great Society is a program that was the pet project of the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, his wife, called the Highway Beautification Project. Now, if you drive along the highway in Texas in the spring, what you're going to notice are the blue bonnets. Very, very beautiful. They always seem to come up like overnight, right? Where I'm from, you've got the tiger lily in Michigan. And the idea here is we've got these great interstate highways, and it's not just great that they connect every corner of the country, but now they need to be made beautiful. And so part of this was about cleaning up the environment, but making them beautiful with these flowers. And every state had their own particular flower, which was a pet project of the First Lady. Now, the Great Society would ultimately emerge into what LBJ called the War on Poverty. Okay, the War on Poverty was an outgrowth of the Great Society, and in particular, the War on Poverty really focused on urban poverty, where it's probably most impacted. Okay, what you begin to see is Lyndon Johnson begin to create some of these federal government programs, like the Job Corps. Okay, Job Corps, you don't hear it or see it anymore, primarily because we call it something different. But back in the 60s and 70s, what this program did is it took people that were probably not headed to college after high school, took them and it put them into programs. For example, if you were interested in cars, it sent you to work at a mechanic's garage. If you were interested in I don't know, insurance, for example, maybe you could go answer phones at the insurance office or file paperwork or something along those lines. But the idea was very simple. Give you on-the-job training, hands-on experience, so that when you graduate high school, maybe you don't have a college degree, but you do have a marketable skill. You do have valuable experience that somebody's going to want to hire you. Upward Bound, we've got Upward Bound. This is a program that traces its roots back to the War on Poverty. VISTA, the Volunteers in Service to America. Think about the Peace Corps, right? What the Peace Corps did was it sent young, industrious college students into developing world countries. Well, VISTA was very similar, but instead of sending them overseas, we sent them into Newark, New Jersey, Oakland, California, Detroit, Michigan, sent them into these struggling urban centers to help them organize life. Okay. Now, I'm not a big statistics guy, but I'm going to throw some statistics at you here at the end of this lecture. In 1964, when Johnson was inaugurated, actually 1965 when he was inaugurated, the poverty level in America, those people living at or below what the federal government determined to be impoverished, was approximately 20%. By 1968, that had lowered to 13%. That's significant. 7% is a very large number in American society. Now, there will be some people that argue, and rightly so, that the 1960s were a very prosperous decade, and so part of this is just an upswing of the economy, and you would expect poverty to go down when your economy is booming. But I don't think that we can so easily dismiss the programs of the Great Society, which begs the question, if the Great Society was indeed great, then how and why, are we left with the legacy that is American poverty? Perhaps Martin Luther King put it best, and again, I'm paraphrasing this, of course, but Martin Luther King said the problem of the Great Society and the War on Poverty was that it didn't spend enough money, right? These big government programs that really take on a taboo-like, character after Ronald Reagan says that the problem in America is not it's government, right? But Martin Luther King says, look, the problem is we don't spend enough money on these programs to really adequately address the problem that is poverty. Instead, we spend billions and billions of dollars on wars overseas. Now think about the context in which he's saying this. In 1968, we're immersed in the Vietnam War, and we're spending tens of billions of dollars on that war every year. And just like Dwight Eisenhower warned us about in his last day as president, when you do that, when you spend money on the military, that means that you cannot spend money on social and civilian programs. And so, as Martin Luther King said, the war on poverty ultimately became a casualty of the Vietnam War. This is the domestic side of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about his foreign policy, which is probably going to leave you with a far less positive understanding of Lyndon Johnson.